bit. Anything with driven development is going to make people's eyes, certain people's eyes go, oh, the programmers are all in, but your product owners, I'm not so sure about that. And anything with testing in the name, the developers don't want anything to do with that. And the product owners probably don't want anything to do with that either. So if you say, well, hey, we're going to do story testing, I don't do testing. I don't play that. So you want people involved. So pay attention to the name that you use. And luckily, these things are largely the same. So you have your pick of names to choose from. So we also Agile. Here, you guys all love Agile, but does anybody have an environment where Agile is not okay? Okay, we're in an Agile user group, and a couple people will admit that, so this isn't going to get you very far unless you're in the middle of an Agile adoption program, and anything with Agile in it is automatically gets a thumbs up from management because, oh, we're going Agile. Then you can slip this in. But otherwise, people are probably sick of hearing about Agile. They just, they want their lives to be better and their projects to be more successful. So maybe you don't want to use that word either. So maybe what we just want to say is, don't call it anything. Don't give it a name.
Front.
I'm just gathering examples. I just want to help us reduce misunderstanding with some examples. I want to clarify the requirements. If you feel the need to name it, specification by example, I can't think of as many arguments with that name as with the others. It's a specification. I want to come up with some examples. I want to reduce misunderstanding. So when we get together to come up with our specification and our examples, if you decide to do that outside of iteration planning, then don't call it a specification meeting because nobody likes meetings. We're back to the names again. Don't call it a meeting. Call it a specification workshop. So let's say, hey, let's have a specification workshop. Let's come together. It's a working workshop. It's not a meeting. Let's come together and come up with some examples to help us understand these stories. So now, if you're going to do this, when might you have a specification workshop? So you could do it during iteration planning. You've talked about the story. Okay, let's come up with some examples. But who here thinks their iteration planning meeting goes on too long and has too many people in it already? Okay. So I got some heads nodding. So maybe iteration planning is not the best time for some of you if you've got a large team and if the meetings go on too long. So maybe you want to have a pre-planning meeting or pre-planning specification works. Now, you don't have to bring everybody to it. But think about this. If you get the product owner and the tester and you're going to be your lead tester and your developer to come together before iteration planning and talk about the stories and improve them before you get to iteration planning, then maybe your iteration planning can be shorter. You come up with, you clarify the story, come up with some better acceptance criteria, come up with some examples, you come prepared, you've thrown out the stories that are bogus or unclear or too big or not ready, or you can't develop it this iteration because of some other requirement or dependency. You throw those out, you throw out the stories that are too big by getting those three amigos together, and a few days in advance of iteration planning, you get ready to make sure iteration planning is short and successful. Yes, Alex?
Yeah, so Scrum talks about grooming the backlog,
yeah.
Right? So that, over time, a lot of folks have been having a lot of trouble with that, and they end up with, like you said, story planning meetings, or iteration planning meetings that are really way long. They're doing all their grooming right now.
Yeah.
So some have suggested that maybe you put a little more process, a little more structure around that if it's not happening organically.
Yeah. If it's not happening naturally, you need to make it happen.
Just have a grooming meeting. Right?
Yeah.
And this is where you do this kind of stuff.
Thank you, Alex. Some other groups that I've seen will do this kind of thing just in time. Particularly if they're a more advanced XP team and they get their iteration planning done really quickly, and right before they start developing, they will come together with their product owner and say, hey, we're about to start coding this, and they'll do a little bit more planning on a specific story. Some Kanban teams do this as well. They will do iteration planning just in time, or they'll do planning for a story just in time. And so you could come up with your examples then, just in time, with just the subset of the team that's going to work on that story. Some other groups kind of do this as a queue replenishment strategy, particularly if they're using a Kanban approach. For example, before they'll put a piece of work into the ready for development column, they have a step that's, let's have a specification workshop. Once we have a specification workshop, you can put it into the queue for development. So that's pretty close to the end of what I wanted to talk about. I think I got 3 more things to do, and yes, I'll let you go first.
Well, with the discussion of when should it happen, as you said, this is a living document.
Mm-hmm.
So as your testers are starting to test things, nothing says their brain shut off at the end of that meeting.
Right.
Right. Where the developers are developing things, people are always going to be going, hey, wait a second, what about?
Right.
What in this case? And so they should be going back and having those conversations again and adding to the document when necessary.
Yep. If anybody didn't hear that, the comment was, no, don't shut your brain off. Don't think that at the end of the iteration planning or end of your specification workshop that it's, oh, that's perfect, chiseled in stone. If you come up with some new example or some new test case, you bring your 3 amigos or maybe the whole team back together and you discuss it and add it to the specification if you need to. Thanks, Steve. Let me look through these assorted little things, and then I think I'd like to get a couple of real-life anecdotes. So the odds and ends are, if you're going to automate these tests, test under the UI. If you can, please. Don't try to test through the UI. You'll end up with more brittle tests that run slower. I'm not going to talk about the page object pattern, but it's an object to represent a page, and you can test with it or through it, and you can Google page object pattern. It's a technique that you may want to consider. If you automate these things, the tests, the automation of the tests is software development. Treat your test code like important software. Refactor it. Clean it up. Make sure it's good code. If you're not the strongest programmer, get your developers to help. In your organization, you need good collaboration between developers and testers to have a good, understandable, maintainable suite of test automation. We're not going to talk about that. We're not going to talk about that. That. Yep.
So you said earlier you would not let developers be the owners for the specifications.
Yes.
Or the QA people. But now you're talking about developers. If you automate this,
Yeah.
developers are going to be refactoring things. If they're not the owners.
Excellent question, Bert. So the question was, earlier I said that don't let developers own this or testers own this, but then I also just said, well, developers, if you're going to automate this stuff, developers have to be involved in the automation. The distinction there is that I want the product owner or the business to feel like they own these examples. I want them to have instant access to it. I want them to be able to update it without firing up Eclipse or IntelliJ or Quality Center or Selenium. And I want to be able to look at these specifications and see just the specifications, not all the automation. So if you use this kind of Gherkin stuff and these kind of tables, you can, using numerous test frameworks, wire these examples up to fixtures, which is the go-between, the glue between these examples and your code. And those fixtures is software development. You need to maintain those things and support them and refactor them and have them be clean code. So I'm not sure if I answered the question. Yes, developers and testers need to work together to come up with those fixtures, the glue code, the automation of these examples. But you don't want your product owners to think that, oh, these examples are just something that the testers are doing and the developers are doing. I don't know what that stuff is. Because you miss out on the biggest value of all of this, is the communication and getting everybody on the same page.
Because the automation is synchronization.
The automation is
Code
synchronization.
and specification.
Oh, it keeps them in sync.
That's
It's the interface. The glue. So I mentioned this paper by Elizabeth Hendrickson, Test Obsessed, and here is a good book. I like this book, and I like the book that came before that, called, I have the online version, so I had to print it, Bridging the Communication Gap.
Here you go.
And, where? Okay, so Bridging the Communication Gap came before Specification by Example by the same author, Gojo
Goiko Adzik.
Goiko Adzik. And these are great books. I strongly recommend both of these. If you buy this one, you can get this one online for free. You can get the PDF of it. There's a whole bunch of, and I'm going to post all these references on the meetup group later, maybe tomorrow or tonight. So there's a whole bunch of books like this. There's books about Cucumber and ATDD by example, and something else by example, and something else by example. And I would get one. These are good, but they're more specific to. Okay, I'm going to do Cucumber, so let's go get the Cucumber book, and we're doing Ruby. So they don't go as. I mean, think about it. We've got 2 whole books on the concept that I'm talking to you about tonight, about communicating and getting on the same page and the value of that and techniques to do that. And then, if you want to automate it, grab the book for whichever automation you're going to do. That would be my recommendation on that.
there's a language, there's an implementation in most languages, PHP or Python or Perl that's doing this. There's a version of Cucumber that runs on top of JVM. So Java, Scala, Clojure, all those languages are covered by Cucumber now. And let it talk with Maven or whatever your build structure, and you can set it into Jenkins and all that stuff.
So, yes, sir.
Just a question. I mean, I've heard Cucumber many different places. So can you guys briefly just educate us what?
Yeah, I can tell you about Cucumber. The hint is gherkin. Can somebody spell that for me?
G-H-E-R.
G-H-E-R-K-I-N. So gherkin is this language, given when then. It's pretty much as simple as that. There's a tiny bit more to it, but very little more to it than that. And they named this language gherkin. And then so there is an automation tool or an automation approach called Cucumber, which is reading this gherkin stuff and helping you run these things as an executable specification and helping you write fixtures to go between these specifications in Gherkin and your system under test, or the application you're building. So Cucumber is an option. It's not the only one. Fitness is another option. And there's probably 20 tools that I could name by looking at the appendix in this book. Does that help?
And how would this fit with, say, unit testing? So you run your unit test and then you run your Gherkin?
So let's come back to this process. My unit test, as a programmer, I'm running them all the time. I'm writing a little bitty test that's just a couple of lines of code and then I make it pass by writing a couple of lines of code in some new method in some class, and I go back and forth, and I may write a handful of tests every hour, and I'm checking stuff in throughout the day. And so the question was the relationship, when do you run this and when do you run that? And so once I'm about to check in or commit my code to the source code repository and to the continuous integration server that's going to run all the tests, I probably want to run some amount of additional automated unit tests as a final check before I check them in to the source code control system and to the continuous integration server. So I may want to run these automated specifications. That would be a fine thing to do.